Okay, I thought I'd make a quick little video. Hopefully it'll be quick. I'm usually too long-winded. Quick little video about doing moral philosophy, testing moral theories, excuse me, and the sorts of things you'll see the authors and the philosophers that we're going to be reading over the semester taking into consideration when they're evaluating moral theories, right? So we've already talked a little bit about in the introduction to philosophy and the introduction to moral philosophy section, the very first lecture, I talked a little bit about definitions of philosophy that help us get a handle a little bit more on what it is to do philosophy. So we had this first kind of technical definition, an intellectual activity of attempting to discern and remove contradictions among non-empirical reasoned beliefs that have universal importance with the resulting benefit of achieving a greater understanding of the world and our place within it. And so, from this definition of doing philosophy as an activity, we can already note that, among philosophical beliefs, among non empirical beliefs, are those that have moral content to them or are about morality in some way. So we could worry about whether we have contradictory moral beliefs and then start looking at the arguments for and against those different beliefs. Come and give you an example of that here in a minute. And then, a little bit more specifically, moral philosophy, its central purpose is to secure valid principles of conduct and values that can be instrumental in guiding human actions and producing good character. And so doing moral philosophy will involve trying to construct a theory of these principles that doesn't have any contradictions in it, right? And again, it could be a theory, either a meta-ethical theory or a normative theory. And of course, rational argumentation plays a key role in philosophy. So we are going to worry about whether certain views about morality can be supported through rational argument or not. And again, when we talk about a theory here, what we mean is something a little bit more specific or more technical. It's an explanation of some phenomena based on some fundamental or general principles that are themselves supported by some kind of evidence or argumentation. They're not just like flights of fancy, right? So a moral theory is going to attempt to, or moral philosophy more broadly, and certainly a moral theory is going to attempt to give some account of the nature of morality. Is it objective or subjective? That realist, anti-realist debate that I talked about in the metaethics section um, on the nature of morality or the status of morality, and then B, when it comes to normative ethics and normative theories, they're going to try to identify and defend some prescriptive standard of right conduct and good living. And again, so we'll have different kind of elements of different theories. Metaethical theories are going to be more about that realism, anti-realism debate. Is it relative? Is it objective? Is it subjective? Is it merely, or is it universal? That sort of debate. And then these normative principles are all going to try and guide actions. They're going to be prescriptive in some way. They're also often going to involve some kind of impartiality standard. Uh, we'll talk about universalizability arguments. Moral reasons are often said to be overriding. So that'll be a thing that pops up in these theories a lot, that moral reasons, whatever that counts as a moral reason, would trump other reasons to act, mainly like just purely self-interested actions, or like financial reasons for acting. Do moral considerations trump those other considerations? It's got to be a public principle, and it's got to be applicable, practical. We got to be able to apply it in some ways. And so by this point, it's still early, probably early in the semester, but we've been reading a little bit about what doing philosophy is like, the areas of philosophy, talking about critical thinking. And I've usually at this point assigned an article on Johnson about law of non-contradiction. And it, emphasizes various aspects of doing philosophy as well. So to try to summarize a bunch of that stuff from some of the other lectures, we've already noted that doing philosophy involves reflecting on and attempting to identify apparent contradictions among our philosophical or non-empirical beliefs, identifying key arguments for and against each of those positions, evaluating the arguments for falsehoods, false premises, fallacies, whether it's a falsehood or a false premise due to an empirical or scientific error or a self-contradiction, a logical error. We got to consider possible replies and rejoinders to those objections. We got to evaluate the relative strength of the cumulative case for and against each of these positions, which we'll only be looking at parts of these cases. We won't have time to go over everything. It's an introduction to philosophy, introduction to moral philosophy here. So, and we'll have to rinse and repeat those kind of actions until we can develop and have an informed enough view to draw a well-reasoned position, even if it's a tentative conclusion. And then again, we've talked about the Socratic method and how that's involved in philosophy. And then from that Johnson article, exercising the principle of charity, avoiding contradictions, avoiding simplistic, self-contradictory versions of relativism, gut thinking, and truthiness. We got to have, epistemic rights to what we can rationally justify. They distinguish between, gut thinking and an appeal to intuition, which I'll come back to here in a minute. They emphasize the concern for truth rather than just saying stuff to get away with things. Um, we talked about Johnson talked about abandoning unsupported beliefs and remaining agnostic when there's insufficient evidence, right? So all those sorts of things are going to be involved in different ways in how philosophers go about trying to construct, evaluate these different moral theories, whether they're meta-ethical theories or normative theories. And so just as an example, identifying a contradiction among philosophical beliefs, got a good example of that here with a meta-ethical contradiction. One of our basic meta-ethic debates is a debate between moral universalism and moral relativism. So if we've got that debate, we've got the moral universalist on the one side and the moral relativist on the other side. They can't both be true at the same time in the same respect. And so here's an argument for one part of that debate, right? A very simple argument, but it's a basic argument for moral relativism. It says there are no universal moral truths, therefore everyone ought to be tolerant of cultures with moralities different from their own. Now, if this is supposed to be the argument, this one doesn't look particularly good. Um, this first premise asserts that there are no universal moral truths, but then the conclusion asserts that everyone, asserting a universal, ought to do a particular thing. So that looks like a contradiction between premise one and conclusion line two. That would mean that that argument's problematic, right? So if that's supposed to be the argument, there's usually, I should point out here, there's usually and often more than one argument to support the same position. So just because you've defeated one argument for a particular view, a particular meta-ethical view like moral relativism or moral universalism, doesn't mean you've defeated that position. It just means that one argument failed, right? So that's one of the things that can make doing philosophy tedious, is you got to go through all the versions, right, and see which one's the strongest possible one. And so in that article on Johnson, where he was talking about moral relativism, again, that we've already covered a little bit of, he says, contrary to the moral relativist claims, that say it would promote tolerance, it could actually promote intolerance. So again, offering trying to show that a particular view has a contradiction involved in it and is therefore probably not a very good argument. It's likely false. The law of non-contradiction says that a proposition and its opposite can't both be true at the same time in the same respect. So if we got an argument that violates that principle, looks like one of the lines in there is false. So, Johnson, I think, rightly points out, that it can be frustrating going through all these different arguments, but it is possible to make progress. Doesn't that give us some reason to think that maybe there's some reasons to consider or reconsider moral universalism? And another really important thing that Johnson points out in that article is the notion of an epistemic right, not a legal or a moral right, but an epistemic right. And what he has in mind there, that idea of epistemic comes from epistemology, which just is the study of knowledge. So when we talk about epistemic rights, we're talking about the right to believe something. All right, not a political right. Obviously, people can believe politically, morally, whatever they want to. We're talking about what can be rationally justified here. And so he emphasized this idea that we have beliefs, that's fine, but when we're doing philosophy, we have to support our beliefs with well-reasoned arguments. So a belief to which one has an epistemic right is a belief that is justified by rational defense and argumentation. That's what we're worried about. If you want to figure out what's true, it doesn't make any progress on that problem to just sit around and appeal to your formal constitutional right to believe whatever you want. So in very similar vein, We're going to be talking about some basic logic and critical thinking, where we go over various types of arguments, how to evaluate them, and different kinds of fallacies or errors in reasoning to avoid. So we're going to be doing that as well along there. We could incorporate the objection and say, yeah, it's a good objection and relevant, but it doesn't really pose that big of a problem to the theory. We could revise our original thesis. Maybe the objection, concede the objection is true, and it's a strong objection, but that you can reformulate the theory so that it doesn't suffer from that objection. Or you might abandon the original thesis altogether, right? There's some different basic strategies to perform there. Here's a brief example of one of those. So Gilbert Harman famously is a contemporary philosopher that defends moral relativism, which is not a particularly popular view among most philosophers, certainly in the history of philosophy, but in contemporary philosophy as well. And he says, so he's pushing back against the kind of simplistic relativism and charge of self-contradiction that appeared in that individual relativism portion of the Johnson article. And he says here, most arguments against relativism make use of a strategy of dissuasive definition. They define moral relativism as an inconsistent thesis. For example, they define it as the assertion that A, there are no universal moral principles, and B, one ought to act in accordance with the principles of one own group, where this latter principle is B, supposed to be a universal moral principle. So there we have a kind of objection we were just kind of considering, right? Earlier, just a minute ago. And he says it's easy enough to show that this version of moral relativism will not do, but that is no reason to think that a defender of moral relativism cannot find a better definition, right? So there's an example of Harman saying, yeah, that works against that version of moral relativism, but what about this other stipulative or precise definition of moral relativism that doesn't suffer from that obvious kind of problem that simple relativism does suffer from? So we'll see various moves like that occurring in various readings throughout the semester. We're also going to encounter universalizability arguments. Doing moral philosophy certainly involves universalizability arguments. We're going to be looking at two basic versions of that, a Kantian one or a deontological one, and another one associated with rule utilitarianism. But the basic idea of a universalizability argument is simple enough. What if everybody did that, right? It's asking what would happen if, what would the consequences be, or would it even be rational for everyone to perform that action? Two different ways of thinking about universalizability arguments. So again, we're going to definitely encounter those. Again, two different basic types that we'll worry about the most: the Kantian universalizability test that goes along with deontology, and then the rule utilitarian version as well. Another thing that we'll see a lot of over the semester is thought experiments. Philosophers love to use thought experiments. These are hypothetical but not logically impossible scenarios designed to stimulate thinking, identify intuitions and beliefs, or maybe even test for logical consistency in application or between principles. So here's an example of a thought experiment in moral philosophy. Here we sit, say 50 people in a lifeboat. To be generous, let's assume our boat has the capacity for 10 or more, making 60 total. The 50 of us in the boat, and the 50 of us are in the boat, and we see 100 others swimming in the water outside, and they ask for admission to the boat or for handouts. How shall we respond to their calls? Well, what should we do? How should we engage in saving lives here, right? We're supposed to save lives as a general moral rule, according to most people, right? Again, near universality with that one. So should we save everyone and accept catastrophe, knowing that that'll overload us? Should we only save 10? Or should we refuse to save any of them? If we save 10, then how do we decide which 10 fairly? Women and children, the most vulnerable, the rich who can pay? Should we have a random lottery, or should we have ranked preference voting? How should we decide which 10 to take, if we decide to take any at all? And when we're thinking about these sorts of cases, what we're doing is trying to identify some basic intuitions, the thoughts that occur to you when we're thinking through these kinds of moral cases, these hypothetical scenarios, these thought experiments are known as our moral intuitions, right? How you answer those sorts of questions says something at least about your initial beliefs, assumptions, and principles, right? So they can, again, be used to stimulate thinking or to maybe test for logical consistency across cases in application. And Johnson, again, when we talk about these thought experiments, it's important to note that this kind of thinking should be distinguished and shouldn't be confused with thinking from the gut. Um, what we're doing is engaged in what he calls here an appeal to intuition. And he says philosophers will sometimes use their own intuition as a litmus test. If an argument or position is contrary to the intuition, then the argument or position is thought to be faulty. But the intuition in most cases are almost universally accepted and thus are thought to point towards facts. For example, philosophers might argue that Jimmy Colbert's director, Jimmy's ethical theory can't be right because it would mean that it's acceptable to torture babies for fun, and that can't be right. That strikes hard against our moral intuition that you're not supposed to cause undue harm, right? So he continues, if the intuition is not universally accepted as baby torture equals wrong, then the philosopher will not think the theory has been refuted, but will merely point out the theory's costs. Philosophers sometimes defend gut feelings with arguments, but good philosophers, and there's the important point, good philosophers will never let their gut be the last word. If their argument fails and their gut is disproven, they reject what it says in favor of the truth. We're supposed to have a concern for the truth and follow the arguments and the evidence to the conclusions to which they lead. So again, a little bit more on thought experiments from another book I sometimes use by Jonathan Wolfe. And he says there, a moral theory that is in line with people's intuitions is usually regarded as having a great advantage. However, in the present case, many people will still disagree with Goodwin, thinking that it's right to abandon the archbishop to save your mother. If you do, then you think Goodwin's theory has counterintuitive consequences, or consequences that can be hard to accept because the theory requires us to at least reject some of our intuitive moral judgments. In any case, we see one use for thought experiments. It's a way of testing a moral theory by considering how it fares against our moral intuitions. If it agrees with your moral intuitions, then you see it as intuitive. If not, then you see it as counterintuitive. So we can worry about whether these thought experiments like the trolley problem or Hardin's lifeboat, the transplant problem, the prisoner's dilemma, what kinds of intuitions they evoke in us, and whether those intuitions can be defended with rational argumentation or not. So again, lots of uses for thought experiments, not only in philosophy, but in moral philosophy as well. So they, again, stimulate thinking, help identify and clarify basic intuitions and beliefs and principles, right? Um, helps us test our intuitions for counterintuitive implications, consistency, and coherence. We need to worry about whether our intuitions fit with the theory or vice versa, and what that means about our intuitions or the theory itself. And then, of course, as we've already talked about a little bit, we're going to worry about contradictions. So Schaefer Landau here in a work says that he's a contemporary philosopher. He says a contradiction occurs when a proposition is alleged to be both true and false. Theories that generate contradictions cannot be true. We would rightly dismiss a mathematical theory that entailed that 2 and 2 did at the end of same time and not equal 4. Suppose ethical subjectivism is correct. If Smith thinks that giving famine aid is mandatory and Jones disagrees, then giving famine relief is and is not morally required. Is it both true and false that giving to famine relief is obligatory? That's a contradiction, right? So trying to look for errors like that in theories, we're going to think that they would count against that theory, the truth of the theory. So a point against, not a point in favor. Same with moral equivalence. Moral equivalence is a double-edged sword. If all moral views are on par with one another, then we lose our basis for issuing substantive moral criticism of unsavory characters such as Nazis or terrorists, for example. If subjectivism is true, then those who approve of anti-Semitism and terrorism are correct in calling such behavior morally right. The views of Hitler or the IRA gunmen are true as long as those views are sincerely held. It's a pretty big consequence of a moral theory then. So moral equivalence entails that that superior to theirs, conflicting moral views are that they're not superior to theirs. Conflicting moral views, got to correct something right there. Conflicting moral views are just different. Neither one is better or worse if everything is equal. So then arbitrariness, similar to the moral equivalence problem. If a theory implies moral arbitrariness, that it's just might as well, moral decision making might as well just be random, then that seems to count against that moral theory, the plausibility of that theory. So if there's no better reason to adopt one ethical theory over another, um, that's a problem, right? That would mean that we're at loggerheads, certainly, at least. So subjectivism claim that moral views are true because one believes them. One does not believe them because they are true, right? So moral views are justified to the extent that they are believed. So any basis whatsoever will confer plausibility. This allows us to see two ways in which subjectivism entails arbitrariness of ethical views. First, one's moral outlook may be justified even if it has no reason at all that supports it. Seems to count against the idea of justification. That one believes it is sufficient to make it true. That starts to look like gut thinking or truthiness. The second kind of case, one does possess reasons to support one's moral views, but the reasons that support a moral belief may fail entirely to move or motivate other informed, rational, good-will people. In this sense, one's views are arbitrary because they're supported by reasons that could, with complete propriety, be rejected by any and all other rational people. Another way to think about it is if morality is just arbitrary, then you've got no basis for claiming one thing is right over it being wrong. That's the implication of arbitrariness. It basically undermines the basic idea of right and wrong because right and wrong are just arbitrarily assigned just assigned according to personal whim, like the way I do or don't like certain kinds of music, right? So, a little bit more on these sorts of counterintuitive implications like equivalence or arbitrariness. Wolff says similarly, just because a moral theory has counterintuitive results, that does not make it false either. So, this, again, another important point about thinking about what does flat out refute versus just maybe count against the plausibility of a theory. However, in the case of morality, we cannot conduct the type of experiments that we've used to establish the theory of gravity, right? Hence, as we have noted, though moral intuitions are often taken to be a significant source of evidence for a theory, some moral philosophers are prepared to consider theories with counterintuitive results as long as their reasons to accept them are good enough. So, in other words, if there's no reason to do it, but some sufficient reason to do it, even if it's not a necessary reason. And so, just to recap a little bit, what we're worried about here, the sorts of things that go into doing philosophy and doing moral philosophy in particular, and then the sorts of considerations that are going to count either for or against the various sorts of theories that we encounter over the semester. And so, again, we're going to have to worry about applying the principle of charity when we want to iron man, not straw man, our opponent's arguments. We want to avoid self-contradiction, fallacies, and false premises. We want to avoid simplistic forms of relativism, gut thinking, truthiness, and rather have a concern for truth and reasons, hence the importance of epistemic rights to what's rationally justifiable. And again, we'll see thought experiments being used all sorts of different ways, and the importance again of bearing the burden of proof, of supporting our positions with not just reasons, but with good reasons, and then abandoning or remaining agnostic views that don't hold up to critical scrutiny. So again, when it comes to that kind of scrutiny, what sorts of things are we worried about? We're going to have to worry about whether the theory relies only or merely on gut thinking and truthiness. If there are false premises or fallacies or contradictions in there, those certainly are going to be more clear-cut reasons for or against at least an argument for a particular theory. Again, more than one argument can usually be given to support any particular theory. And then again, these counterintuitive implications like equivalence and arbitrariness are gonna typically count some way toward against a theory rather than for it. So these are the sorts of things you need to be looking at and looking out for when we're evaluating arguments and reading these different philosophers trying to construct and evaluate arguments about morality, whether they're meta-ethical theories or normative ethical theories. All right, hope this helps a little bit. Let me know if you have any questions. Shoot me an email or ask me in class.